Hello, and welcome to another episode of Spartalk. I'm joined again by Vincent to discuss in more depth our perspectives on the world situation today. Hi, comrade.
Hello.
So, before we get started, I just want to remind our listeners that our organization, the International Communist League, recently voted a document on our understanding of the huge changes we're witnessing and how we see our tasks as revolutionaries within that. Now, for regular listeners, you'll also know that episode 5, which is titled US Imperialism Turns the Screws, is in fact a presentation that Comrade Vincent gave on this topic. But I have him back here with me today to basically go into more depth into, the various themes in that speech. And what we're going to do is go into depth, but do this in a series of episodes, with each episode taking up a key question. So in this first episode in the series, I want to start by talking about the general situation that we're witnessing internationally. So I guess, everybody recognizes that we're entering a period of acute crises. That's just a fact. But depending on one's political persuasion, people either see that this is now the beginning of the end of the West, the rise of China and Russia. This is the start, or this is the, intensification of inter-imperialist rivalries. There's a lot of different understandings, and there's a lot of confusion as well. So my first question to you is, could you help us to understand what is at the root of all this turmoil?
Yeah, it isn't also just the personality of Trump. There's something...
Yeah, that's a big one, yeah.
Something more fundamental behind. No, yeah, a lot of confusion. And unless you take a step back and try to think a little bit about how has been the world in the last decades and how is it fundamentally changing, you can't really make sense of what's going on. And you sort of have to put the daily chatter, the daily hysteria, the liberal commentators. So you have to put all this aside to understand anything about the world. And basically, our starting point is that the fundamental feature that defines the world situation is the relative decline of the United States. So for 80 years, since World War II, the US was the hegemonic power of the capitalist world. Out of its victory out of World War II, it built its own system, its own empire, and it successfully destroyed the Soviet Union in 1991-92. And the fall of the Soviet Union led to the complete world hegemony of the United States over the world. However, the fundamental point is that American supremacy also contained the elements which would fuel its decline. So, for example, first of all, the U.S. industry, which used to be really the backbone of its power. After World War II, the U.S. was the industrial power of the world, really was largely offshored to the global south. It still exists, but it is a shadow of what it used to be. The U.S. military really overextended itself in forever wars in the Middle East, the expansion of NATO all the way to Russia's border, and really overstretch itself. And then globalization, the extension of world trade, has led to substantial economic growth in other countries, China in particular. We'll come back to it. And so all these factors have undermined the position of the U.S. Yet, the United States remains really the world superpower. They control still the world reserve currency. Most of trade is still done in U.S. dollar and goes through Wall Street, which remained the center of the financial system. So the U.S. effectively controls the world financial system still. And the American military, although deindustrialization is starting really to undermine it, remains still the most powerful force on the planet and really the guarantor of security. So if you're an investor somewhere in the world, you usually often rely on the U.S. Army to secure your interest abroad. And so the fundamental tension and the fundamental source of turmoil in the world is really this growing and growing contradiction between the U.S., which remain hegemonic, which remain the number one leader of the world. However, in contradiction with its diminishing economic power. That's really these two factors which are coming into conflict. And what we see with Trump is that this contradiction between the economic power and the hegemonic position is now reaching a breaking point, and that's really at the source of all the turmoil. If you think about it, every war that we're seeing right now, every economic turmoil has everything to do with the U.S. being in decline and Trump representing a shift in strategy to confront America's decline.
So I think that's very useful in terms of saying, well, no, this is not the crazy personality of Trump that's doing this because he's just, gone off his rocker, but this really stems from the underlying dynamics that fueled and also undermined American hegemony. Okay, I think that's quite useful. But I do want to push this farther a little bit because somebody could be listening and they could be like, well, Why is it that it needed somebody like Trump to really try and address this contradiction between the hegemonic position and its weakening economic position? Like, why couldn't the Democrats just recognize this? They're not stupid. The establishment's not stupid. They all recognize where things are at. So why couldn't we have, the shoring up of U.S. hegemony under the Democrats, for example? Why did it need a Bonapartist figure like Trump?
Well, in many ways, the Biden's presidency was also confronting U.S. decline and took a number of measures, which we're also seeing a continuation of under Trump. So, for example, increased intervention of the state into the economy think of the CHIP Acts or the Inflation Reduction Act, stuff like that. These are all measures that were taken by Biden to shore up U.S. decline. But the reason why we have Trump, and it's true that Trump we're not saying it's an irrelevant factor, he is tearing up the sort of the world order in many ways. The reason is because Trump represented a fundamental shift, really, in strategy. What you had a fight for the last decade in both parties of the United States over which way forward for the U.S., how to confront that decline. In the Democratic Party, you had this polarization with the establishment and the left. And in the Republican Party, you also had a similar thing. The difference is that the establishment Democratic Party just beat the left opposition. And what happened is that the Democratic Party really doubled down on the liberal order as the best defenders of the liberal order. What do I mean by the liberal order? I mean basically the world order set up by the US, certainly after World War II, but really consolidated in the post-Soviet period. So think about liberal democracy, think about the UN, US financial institution, the rule of law, and all these sorts of values, and really what was the norm for many, many years. And they wanted to double down on this course. And Trump, really, his strategy was to say, look, the liberal path is what has undermined the U.S. It's with globalization and free trade, which is a major pillar of the liberal order. It's with free trade that we've lost a lot of our industry. And these liberal values and campaign have just undermined the role of the family, has undermined the power of our military, has undermined all these sorts of things which are necessary to shore up our hegemony. And then, crucially, the Democrats doubling down on liberalism really became discredited in the working class. So Trump, his main difference with the other wing of the ruling class is that you need to tear up the way things have been done for the last few decades if you want to shore up the U.S.'s position. Now, obviously, I'm saying this for, we don't support any wing of the ruling class. We're opposed to both. But just to explain a little bit the sort of factional struggle that we've seen in the last decade in the U.S. ruling class.
So as part of tearing up that liberal order, would you say that that's what goes hand in hand with, or that's at the root of the current, basically ICE going crazy in the US right now and the huge reaction against immigrants that we see, not just in the US, but in many countries of the West? Because I'm trying to also give our listeners a bit of an understanding of okay, you've got the tearing up the liberal situation, but then it takes this really grotesque expression as well, and then of course there's a tendency to kind of, I think, in the eyes of somebody, an ordinary worker, they might be like, oh, well, it was better under the Democrats, because obviously the people in charge right now, they are literally ripping people out of their families and sending them, to Mexico and wherever. So I guess my question is the huge offensive we're seeing against minorities, oppressed immigrants in the US, but also in other countries. How does that go hand in hand with this tearing up of the liberal order?
Yeah, the question of immigration looms large. The goal of Trump, basically, he's putting up a huge show in LA right now. He's sending the National Guard, the military, really to crush these demonstrations, and he's really just seizing on an opportunity to polarize even more the country between U.S.-born worker versus foreign-born or just foreigners in general. That's a useful thing it's obvious that Trump wants to terrorize a whole layer of the American working class. It's much more profitable to have a layer of the working class which works in the shadows, which is in fears constantly. The big difference is that the Democrats used to adopt a more pro-immigrant posture, more pro-immigrant messaging. They still do in many respects, but would do a lot of the same thing. Maybe not as openly, but usually a little more covertly. But Biden deported more people than Trump's term, if I'm not mistaken. Obama was like the deporter in chief. Yeah. So there's always the same mechanism. And I think in one way that it might become fundamentally different is that for 30 years or even more. The United States has seen a massive rise in immigration. So the numbers that we had, like, I don't know, a year or two ago were similar to the late 19th century. That's a phenomenon we've seen throughout the Western world, is because the liberal bourgeoisie, which was really in charge, love to have a lot of immigrant because they can exploit them, because they can use them as cheap labor. They can use them to undermine the general conditions of labor. And and therefore the pro-immigrant rhetoric was kind of a cornerstone of the liberal rulers because it reflected their class interests. And I think Trump represents a wing of the ruling class, which not necessarily wants to break with using immigrant labor. You know, the capitalists always love immigrant labor because they can exploit them and squeeze them. But I think wants to break with the appearance of being pro-immigrant, this sort of liberal veneer which they used to push their politics, and more towards sheer exploitation. I think this is how it fits into the switch we're seeing on the political level, but also on the economic level.
Okay. Before getting more generally into the world situation, I just want to ask one more question as regards to the US, which is, you write here that there is a difference between the aims and ambitions of the American ruling class and its capacity to carry those out. Because obviously, as we started with, you know, the root of this turmoil is really the aim of the American ruling class to try and shore up U.S. hegemony, right? Now, it's one thing that they want to do this, but just because they want to do it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will, or that it'll be a straightforward, road.
Yeah.
I would like you to comment a little bit about what exactly what is the capacity of this? Because as we're seeing things play out, when Trump did his tariffs, there was huge craziness all over, you know, for example, with China, they're still kind of doing their little dance. I think there's a deal in the cards. But right now, a lot of the Western countries are upping their defense spending. Trump is getting his way in many regards. So there's the aims, but just because they want to shore up their hegemony, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be so straightforward.
Well, there's sort of a big picture thing and then a more immediate thing. So the big picture is that, what does Trump want? He wants to create a solid pro-American bloc in the world, you know, align all countries which are allies to the US really fully behind Trump's trade policy and political projects. This increased military spending, crack down on immigration, crack down on dissent more generally in society, crack down on the working class, and essentially confront and isolate China, which is America's main rival. Now, there are many obstacles to this because there needs to be like sort of a political revolution in Europe, for example, to use these words with a lot of quotes. I mean, I'm saying that there needs to be a huge political battle and shift in Europe. There is going to be responses from the working class, you know, if it gets crushed, whether in the US or elsewhere. Trump needs to extract more from US allies in terms of trade relations, and US allies will resist this. And crucially, there's a difference between the US 40 years ago and now. The US is economically less powerful. It has less levers than it used to. So in the grand scheme of thing, it's not a given that Trump's project or the trend he's setting will actually work, you know, and there is a chance that this sort of project of a pro-US bloc will sort of fall into pieces. I think the economy, the coming economic crisis, or this is going to be the decisive element, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, in another episode.
Yeah, because what you've just said, it makes me think like, oh, well, could somebody then think that, okay, well, maybe the U.S. will gradually just weaken and wither away, you know, stop being an imperialist power. And I know we're going to get to that in the next episode, actually, but you're already hinting that, no, that's not going to happen, but it's not guaranteed that the U.S. is going to get its way either.
Yes, it's not. Now, just on the short-term picture, when you read liberal medias from the Guardian to even the Financial Times, honestly, they interpret every little thing as like a failure of the U.S., you know? Like Trump had to back down to China. Trump had to concede to this or that. You know, he's not talking so much about annexing Canada, blah, 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 blah. Like they're always constantly noting every little thing as like, aha, here's the proof that it's not working. But this is really missing the whole trend that Trump is setting. He's essentially changed American politics forever in the direction of the country. And also Trump, he tries stuff. You know, he goes all the way and then comes back a little bit, but still changes. China is a good example. There's a deal on the table. We don't know exactly the details now, but, you know, there was the whole trade war. Tariffs were like 145%. Then he backed down and tariffs were 30%. But you know what? If you a few years ago, if you would have said that, yeah, we're going to impose 30% tariffs on China, which is a huge trading partner of the entire Western world, it would have been like inconceivable. So I think it's important not to forget that. He tries stuff, some stuff doesn't work, some stuff does work, goes all the way, then pulls back a little bit, but still ends up pushing his trend. And fundamentally, on the shorter term level, in US domestic politics, although there's been demos or whatever, there's no coherent political force which opposes him yet at the moment. And even on the world scene, there's not, everybody's reacting to him. He's setting the tone to everything.
Right. I guess this brings us directly to the question of, the other illusions that, this is inter-imperialist rivalries and China's really got the upper hand and so on and so forth. We disagree with that quite outright. So we do not think that this is a period characterized by the growth of inter-imperialist rivalries, like that Russia and China aren't these competing imperialist powers. I wonder if you can comment a little bit about, like, now stepping off the American terrain and thinking more generally. The US wants to basically have a strong pro-US bloc in opposition to China. That's our basic understanding. But yeah.
It's important because there's so many, actually most of the Marxist left views the world right now as like the main thing that characterizes it is inter-imperialist rivalries. And on a superficial level, for some people, it could sound true. Like, China has grown, like that's obviously the case, that China has risen tremendously in the last decade, and, Russia's invading Ukraine. So on a superficial level, it can sound true. But if you actually start scratching the surface and think a little bit more fundamentally, you cannot understand the world this way, China's growth has been like tremendous, but China not building an empire, They're not trying to take colonies away from the United States. And in many ways, actually, China's growth has been totally from within the US-dominated system. What they've been fighting about for the last few months has been to stop Trump from decoupling them. That's been the really the worldview of the Chinese Communist Party, is to keep that old globalized system. What they would like is a globalized world without the U.S. at the head, but that's completely illusory because globalization was fundamentally provoked by the U.S. So China it's false to say it's an imperialist power, and I'm not even going to get into its internal regime. It's not even a capitalist state, so therefore cannot be imperialist in the capitalist sense of the word.
And then what about the Russian aspect of it?
Yeah, it's mainly it's the same for China, but it's even more the case with Russia. It's really a hysteria. Like, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not provoked by like the expansion of Russian capitalism. That's what imperialism is. It's like a country, the expansion of a capitalist country where it needs to export capital into other markets. It needs to seize other markets to grow and impose its domination on other countries. That's not what we've seen with the Ukraine war. What we've seen in the last 30 years is NATO has expanded from Germany all the way to Eastern Europe, to the Baltic state, to the Balkans, all the way to the borders of Russia. So that's been the trend in the last 30 years, the expansion of the US. And Russia, it's gone to a point because the U.S. violated Russia's red lines like a bunch of times. And it's gone to the point where Russia was forced, really put against the wall to react and stop that tendency when the question of Ukraine joining NATO and the EU came to the fore. It doesn't mean that we support Russia's invasion. We'll do a whole episode on this. But we have to look at the Ukraine war as Russia reacting to the U.S. overextension, actually, to its very borders. Right. So when you take a step back, you see that actually the world is an American empire. It's an American empire, an empire in decline, an empire which has less and less means to maintain itself. So there are other powers, yes, taking advantage, trying to get a better position in it, but it is an American empire. And this framework hasn't been broken down. There isn't a rival empire that has appeared, on the scene.
Yeah, I think to start wrapping up this episode of the series, given this understanding of the world, which is based on a materialist understanding, a Marxist understanding, the fundamental political question posed for the workers' movement and for the socialists is: will U.S. imperialism be defeated, or will it continue to drag the world into a spiral of reaction, immiseration, and war? Like, that is really the choices we're faced with. And from this, only if you have this understanding will you then start to draw out some clear tasks.
Mhm.
And I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about the political implications of having this understanding and how it impacts our work as revolutionaries.
Yeah. Well, you see that this is very important. If you think like the main thing in the world is Russian imperialism growing, then you're going to think that the main issue is to beat back Russia. And if we've already talked about how the world is an American empire. So if you're a socialist and you think that the main thing is Russian expansion, you find yourself aligned with the designs of the American empire. Same thing if you think the main thing is about China versus the US and inter-imperialist rivalry. I'm sorry, China is encircled by the US.
Mm-hmm.
China actually, what they're doing is they're trying to shield themselves from US aggression, from the United States trying to choke their economy. So you see how, if you think that it's inter-imperialist rivalry, has an impact on what you will do on the ground. You end up aligning yourself, you end up capitulating essentially to the domination of the number one imperialist power, the United States. So for us, really, what is it? Is that it's an American empire, it's in decline, it's trying to shore up its position by trying to crush everyone. So our goal is to organize and push forward the struggle against US imperialism.
Right.
However, we understand that, and we'll get into this more, that you cannot do this properly if you have a nationalist program, or if you are yourself a bourgeoisie, a ruling class, or if you are talking about the Chinese Stalinist Communist Party, essentially. All these forces in various ways, because they are opposed to revolution, because they do not seek to overthrow the entirety of US hegemony, but just seek to rearrange essentially its domination, cannot lead really a consistent and progressive struggle against US imperialism. And that's where it falls onto, we believe you need communist leadership to really end US hegemony. And we believe that's really the historic task of the working class since basically 1945. That's the thing. Since 1945, really the historic task has been centrally the struggle against the domination of US imperialism and its allies. You know, it has all allies, European imperialism, Japan, which we'll get into a little more maybe in another episode. The US has sort of this united front of imperialist powers under its leadership. And really, that's the historical task of communists. And that's why those who think it's China, it's Russia, are totally wrong and end up really imbibing into, well, serving the interests of the American empire in a certain sense, directly or indirectly.
Okay. I think on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the series. We've already started talking about the next episode, which is going to be on gradualism. So why can you not just have the peaceful rise or decline of imperialist powers, right?
Yeah.
We've touched on China and Russia already, but also the flip side. You know, the US is not going to go down without a fight. We're not just going to gradually have de-dollarization. This is just not how it works. But we'll do that in the next episode. So we'll leave you here for today. And yeah. Okay.
See ya.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.